In our original video on the Ukraine conflict, the Ukraine narratives, we explained that Russia's actions in the current conflict stem from a historic hostility towards NATO and NATO expansionism. But one interesting question we were asked in response to the video is, why does Russia perceive the West as a threat? To answer this question, we have to consider two parts: the Russian anxiety over the West's military influence, particularly through NATO, and over its political influence. To understand the first part, a military perspective, we have to return to the end of the Russian Empire and the formation of the USSR. But this time, from Russia's perspective, rather than Ukraine's. The days of the Russian Empire were the last time Russia could be truly said to have been aligned with Western Europe. The country's monarch was a cousin of both the British and German kings. Russia was aligned with France politically. The East-West split in Europe didn't so much exist. That all came crumbling down when these three cousins found themselves on different ends of conflict. The Germans heading the Central Powers, the British and the Russians fighting for the Allies in the First World War. After 3 years of that war, there was an even further schism, as Russia overthrew the Tsar and broke with the Allies. It's late 1917. The October Revolution just happened. Russia has lost large chunks of its territory to independence movements. The Russian Empire is dead. Its successor, the Russian Republic, is dying. Most of the country is now under communist rule, as the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, with the Soviet Communists, quickly signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers to remove their country from the war. The Allies did not accept the Russian Empire's demise and the end of its participation in the war effort. They led an Allied intervention in response. With the Allies giving their support to the remaining anti-Soviet forces in the country, the so-called White Russians, hoping to overthrow the Soviets and create a puppet regime that would return to the war effort and continue to oppose Germany and the rest of the Central Powers, this Allied invasion spread all over Russia and its former empire. But only a few months later, the Central Powers collapsed and the First World War ended with an Allied victory, allowing the Russians to write off their treaty obligations and making an Allied intervention in Russia pointless for military purposes. But some of the Allies still wanted to carry on the war in Russia for ideological reasons. The Soviets had taken over through violent revolution, and there were fears of that revolution spilling over to the rest of Europe and the wider world, prompting the Allied forces to stay for 2 more years, meddling in the already incredibly chaotic Russian Civil War, trying to contain the spread of communism. But eventually, both sides found carrying on a waste. The Soviets restrained their revolutionary ambitions to the former Russian Empire, and the Allies left them to it. In 1920, most of the Allied powers finally decided to withdraw, leaving the Soviets to take over all of Russia and much of its former empire as well, forming the USSR. The last troops to leave were Japanese forces, who left the remaining pockets of territory in 1925. One book by historian James Lowen, called Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong, describes the intervention like this.
Few Americans who were not alive at the time know anything about our unknown war with Russia, to quote the title of Robert Maddox's book in this fiasco. Not one of the 12 history textbooks in my original sample even mentioned it. Russian textbooks, on the other hand, give the episode considerable coverage.
It then goes on to quote Maddox, a historian, on the intervention.
The immediate effect of the intervention was to prolong a bloody civil war, thereby costing thousands of additional lives and wreaking enormous destruction on an already battered society. And there were longer-range implications. Bolshevik leaders had clear proof that the Western powers meant to destroy the Soviet government if given the chance.
Finally, the book summarizes the conflict in this way.
This aggression fueled the suspicions that motivated the Soviets during the Cold War, and until its breakup, the Soviet Union continued to claim damages for the invasion.
Essentially, the USSR's rivalry with the West began immediately after it was formed, because of the history of capitalist leaders trying to destroy the communists. And the communists trying to dethrone the capitalist leaders didn't originate in the Cold War. it was there from the very start, decades before. While people from Western countries mostly forgot about the Allied invasion, the Soviets had a long memory, and this is something passed down to the latest generations of Russians today. The only real gap in this period of Soviet-Western rivalry for the following decades was World War II, where the USSR and Western powers joined hands after being attacked by the Nazis and worked towards a common interest, defeating Nazism and the Nazi German-led Axis powers. But even this did not come easy, and the big three of the Allies, Britain, the USA, and the Soviets, only truly came together after they had been attacked. The Soviets by Operation Barbarossa, the British by the Blitz, the US by Pearl Harbor. And after the Axis was defeated, when the Soviets and the USA were left as the two superpowers of the world, they returned to anxiety and mistrust. From this anxiety, the USSR formed their alliance, the Warsaw Pact, and the US formed theirs, NATO. NATO was an alliance aimed at countering the Soviet Union, of which Russia was a key member. But while NATO was a clear threat to Russia, it was a threat that existed only in theory. NATO existed to fight a Third World War, and that was a war which never came to pass. In terms of Russia's anxiety towards the West politically, their Cold War fears were simple enough to explain. The USSR, which Russia was part of, was communist and a superpower. The West was anti-communist and a rival superpower. But what about after the Cold War, when Russia became its own nation? The Western nations are well remembered for their support of the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, whose actions led to the end of the Cold War and the formation of the Russian Federation. But Russians think about these events very differently to how Westerners do. Gorbachev's term as leader of the USSR was marked by three main policies: perestroika, glasnost, and the Sinatra Doctrine. Perestroika involved a restructuring of the Soviet economy from a planned model to a market one. Glasnost, the loosening of political restrictions on Soviet society, especially regarding the media and speech. And the Sinatra Doctrine, a complete overhaul of Soviet foreign policy, a switch from an interventionist stance known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, where Eastern Bloc states would be kept in the Soviet orbit and maintain Soviet-style political systems no matter what, to a non-interventionist stance where Soviet troops would be withdrawn from the Eastern Bloc nations and their people would be given the freedom to choose for themselves between Communist Party rule and Western-style representative rule. In the West, all of these policies were viewed highly positively, and this led to an unprecedented warming of relations between Western nations and the USSR. They represented a shift toward freedom. Gorbachev was regarded as a kind of architect of liberty, but in the Soviet Union itself, they proved far more divisive. Perestroika was intended to drag the Soviet economy out of stagnation and promote growth. Instead, it resulted in the exact opposite trend. The Soviet economy spiraled into decline. While glasnost was more of a success, creating possibly Russia's freest era in recent memory, it also opened the floodgates of ethnic tensions as boundary and status disputes surrounding the Soviet republics, issues which had previously been kept quiet by Soviet censorship, began to be voiced openly. Several autonomous regions of the republics, in particular the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, and Chechnya in Russia, sought to become republics in their own right, still part of the USSR, but independent from their home countries. Despite not even having autonomy, the Transnistria region of Moldova then also declared independence after holding a referendum, sparking a war between Transnistrian rebels and the Moldovans. Constitutional and ethnic conflicts were breaking out throughout the USSR. And lastly, the Sinatra Doctrine led to major anxieties among Soviet leaders that the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc could give way to major security problems for the USSR. Figures like Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, and even Gorbachev himself expressed fears that Eastern Bloc countries breaking from the Soviet orbit could seek to join NATO in conversations with Western leaders like British Prime Minister John Major and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. While these leaders assured the Soviets at the time that NATO expansion wasn't on the cards, the security economic, and ethnic tensions in the USSR reached their breaking point, and in August 1991, Yazov, along with other figures like KGB leader Vladimir Kryuchkov, led a coup to overthrow Gorbachev. The coup failed, but these events killed off the legitimacy the Soviet Union had left, and Gorbachev ended up having to take a back seat to his political rival, Russian President Boris Yeltsin. While Gorbachev is remembered poorly, Yeltsin did far more damage. Yeltsin was the man who finally pulled the trigger on the USSR, as he, together with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus, signed Belovets Accords, which, although legally disputed, practically brought the Union to an end. As leader of the newly independent Russia, Yeltsin caused even more havoc than Gorbachev. Unlike Gorbachev, who wanted to preserve the Soviet structure by reforming it, Yeltsin wanted to destroy it outright, by any means necessary. He did this by rapidly forcing through reforms much more extreme than Gorbachev's perestroika, switching the economy from state pricing to market pricing right after taking power, even though the market had barely even been created, and was still adjusting from a Soviet management style based on bureaucratic planning to a private management style based on profit earnings. The result of this was an inflation rate of crackpot proportions, over 2,000% in 1992 and roughly 800% in 1993, and unemployment, which was nearly non-existent in the Soviet era, rose through the decade of the 1990s, reaching over 10% of the whole population, around 14 million people by the decade's end. The new Russia began its life in a death spiral. Throughout this process, Western governments continued to support Yeltsin as he dragged Russia to its knees, offering Yeltsin over $1 billion in aid to push through the reforms. Just for comparison, so you can see just how bad those inflation numbers were, the inflation rate of modern-day Russia, even under sanctions and in the middle of a major war, reached a high of around 17%, with unemployment at about 5%. The reaction to these reforms was massively split in Russian society, with some being horrified by the country's economic collapse, and others hopeful that the end result would make the suffering worthwhile. The Russian parliament, the Supreme Soviet, was in the first camp of the split and pushed against Yeltsin, attempting to block further reforms. After a referendum in April 1993 failed to resolve the dispute between Yeltsin and the parliament, he dissolved it in September 1993, even though constitutionally he didn't have the power to do so. The parliament refused to dissolve and retaliated by impeaching Yeltsin, leading to a standoff resembling a civil war. As the streets turned to mayhem, both sides appealed for military intervention. In early October, the Russian army decided to side with Yeltsin and bombed the parliament building with tanks, forcing the parliamentarians to surrender. A new parliament, the Federal Assembly, was then formed by Yeltsin in December 1993, along with a new constitution which gave much more power to the Russian presidency at the expense of the parliament. Following this brutal episode, where elected politicians had been silenced with tanks, the leaders of the free world, of course, supported, yes, that's right, Yeltsin. Western governments blamed all the violence from 1993 on Yeltsin's opponents and hailed him as a democratic reformist, despite the fact that his reforms created mass poverty and turned Russia from an emerging democracy with some separation of powers towards an authoritarian system with power truly in the hands of one person, the president. The end result of this process was a system where a select few elites, mostly former influential bureaucrats and gangsters associated with organized crime, swallowed up the property previously owned by the Soviet state while shutting the Russian people out of the picture. These elites then used all of their acquisitions to create massive financial empires, with control over not just the financial sectors, but also the media. In the West, we usually dub these elites the oligarchs, and we don't have much love for them in the modern day. The combination of Yeltsin's constitutional changes and the disproportionate influence of the oligarchy essentially concentrated power into the hands of a very small minority, stifling the Russian democratic process just as it was emerging. As this massive internal crisis in Russia was unfolding, there were two big international issues for Russia: NATO expanding its military role and the post-Soviet wars. To sum up the post-Soviet wars, when the 15 new countries came about from the ashes of the USSR, there were populations that didn't want to be part of them and were willing to fight to do so. The three main flashpoints of these for Russia were the regions of Transnistria, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. Following the Soviet collapse, the war between Moldova and the Transnistrian separatists continued. Moldova became its own country, with Transnistria internationally recognized as one of its territories. But the separatists had already established themselves by this point as a breakaway state, renaming Soviet Transnistria to the Pridnestrovian Moldovan Republic, or more simply, Transnistria. The conflict ended in 1992 with a Russian intervention. Russian troops acted as peacekeepers and forced the Moldovans into a ceasefire. To this day, Transnistria is its own country, but recognized by the international community as part of Moldova. The South Ossetia and Abkhazia wars followed a similar pattern. After a period of fighting between the Georgian military and the two separatist factions, Russia intervened on behalf of the separatists, and South Ossetia and Abkhazia became their own countries, though still recognized internationally as part of Georgia. While these post-Soviet conflicts were taking place, NATO became a major concern. Russia had already expressed opposition to NATO, with Yeltsin adopting his predecessor's opposition to NATO expansion. But this concern grew as the organization began acting further afield. In the 9 years after the end of the USSR, NATO conducted 10 different military operations, the first in the organization's history, all taking place outside NATO borders. These 10 operations involved interventions in a foreign conflict called the Yugoslav Wars, a series of conflicts in a steadily disintegrating Yugoslavia, a nation which was facing insurgencies from multiple members of its union trying to gain independence, and several other wars between ex-members that already had. Yugoslavia was another case of a multinational diverse country collapsing into ethno-nationalist conflict, like the past collapses of Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, or the USSR, but on a slightly smaller scale. 9 of NATO's operations involved Bosnia and Herzegovina, an autonomous province of Yugoslavia that gained independence and immediately collapsed into war between 3 groups: Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. Many of the Serbs had rejected independence from Yugoslavia and formed a separatist state inside it, known as Republika Srpska, fighting bitterly with the Croats and Bosniaks. The first 6 operations resolved this dispute by blockading Yugoslavia, enforcing sanctions against the region, and carrying out airstrikes against the Serb forces in Bosnia, pressuring the warring parties to come to a deal in 1995 called the Dayton Accords. In these accords, the Serbs agreed that Serb territories of Bosnia would become part of Republika Srpska. Croat and Bosniak territories would become part of the territory called the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the 2 territories would unite as one country called Bosnia and Herzegovina, separate from Yugoslavia. The remaining 3 NATO operations in Bosnia involved enforcing this agreement. The last of NATO's Yugoslav operations involved another territory, Kosovo, a conflict which will be discussed on more detail in the final episode of the series. For now, what you need to know is that Kosovo was, at the time, a region of Serbia, a member state of Yugoslavia. In this last NATO operation, NATO forces bombed Yugoslavia, forcing Yugoslav forces to retreat from Kosovo and allowing Kosovo to split from Serbia to become its own country. In short, at the end of the Cold War, the Russians were essentially watching in real time as their old enemy changed from a defensive alliance to an offensive one, creating entirely new countries through their interventions in the space of only a few years after the collapse of the USSR. And they were powerless to do anything about it. These episodes essentially reignited the tension between Russia and NATO that was supposed to have been buried after the Soviet era, driving a wedge between Yeltsin and his Western allies. That alliance still prevailed as a product of mutual interest. The West wanted Yeltsin to stay in power, and so did he. In 1995, when Yeltsin's popularity was in the gutter, he received US support in aid of his bid to be re-elected in 1996, an election he narrowly won. US President Bill Clinton agreed to slow the process of NATO enlargement and speed up the delivery of a major loan to Russia from the IMF to boost Yeltsin's election prospects. On top of this, a US organization known as the IRI, or International Republican Institute, offered training to activists in Russia. This was known as democracy promotion.
As a political establishment, We thought it was imperative that Yeltsin win, or that someone like Yeltsin win, in June of 1996, in order to continue the reform process. There was deep concern, particularly after the Duma elections, in which the communists did much better than we expected they would do, that if they came to power, it would set the country on a reverse course back towards a Soviet-type system. This was a classic case of the ends justifying the means, and we did get the result that we wanted. We got the result that our partners, reformers in Russia, wanted. And it's after we got that result that a lot of this began to unravel very visibly for people both in Russia and the West. The administration narrowed its focus down to the economic part of it, a certain type of economic determinism, that if we just get the markets right, this would bring in foreign investment, lead to a Russian recovery, spread the wealth and develop a middle class which would be supportive of democratic values. There is a certain magic to that formula. After all, this is what we thought had happened in places like South Korea in the 1960s and 1970s, with economics leading to the social demand for more democratic politics. So how did we justify it all to ourselves after Yeltsin's re-election? Our rhetoric was still not just economic reform, but the development of democracy, of a democratic state. We narrowed down the definition of democracy largely to elections, and that's what we focused on. In fact, this had been the refrain throughout the Yeltsin period, that the key here was elections. In April 1993, Yeltsin goes to the people for a vote of support. Yes, October 1993 was a misfortune, a tragedy, but yet, Yeltsin went to the people and got another vote of support in December 1993. This is what democracy is about, people expressing their will. And even in 1996, although we're aware of the massive pressure and some of the violations of Russian law that went into Yeltsin's electoral campaign, we managed to persuade ourselves that this is what the outcome would have been in any event, even if they hadn't done this, because after all, the Russian people don't want to go back to communism.
So essentially, the Clinton administration was, consciously or not, placing their insistence that the Russians embrace capitalism above the process of turning Russia into a real democracy. And they lied to themselves by pretending the two were the same thing. Even as the undemocratic nature of the new Russian establishment, headed by the politicians and oligarchs, was becoming more and more clear. But while Yeltsin and Clinton seemed to have a mutual understanding on Russia's direction, they didn't agree on Europe's. And after Yeltsin's re-election, those tensions were dragged up again. In October 1996, 3 months after Yeltsin had been returned to power, Clinton returned to the topic of NATO expansion, calling for the first ex-Eastern Bloc countries to join the alliance by 1999, and insisting that Russia would not get a veto on the matter. Clinton got his wish, with Czechia, Poland and Hungary joining in 1999, a year that was closed out by Yeltsin's resignation as president, passing the problem of NATO onto his successor, Vladimir Putin. It was only after the Yeltsin era, when Putin succeeded Yeltsin as president of Russia, that Russia truly began to recover and regain its prominence in the world. And the experience of being reduced to a political and economic laughingstock by the fall of the USSR, aided by Western support for Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, left Russia especially wary of Western influence. Of course, the irony is that in some ways Putin benefited from that influence. Putin was Yeltsin's protege, and the constitution forced through by Yeltsin, with the backing of Western rhetoric and piles of cash, gave the Russian presidency immense power that Putin could rely on. But Russia's first-hand experience with Western-inspired democratization and privatization was an absolute disaster, and this was something that laid heavy on Putin's mind. The dramatic decline of Russian clout caused by the Soviet collapse is something he would stop at nothing to recover from.
In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union grew weaker and subsequently broke apart. That experience should serve as a good lesson for us, because it has shown us that the paralysis of power and will is the first step towards complete degradation and oblivion.
For the first few years of this project of his, NATO stayed mostly quiet. Its operations after the Yugoslav wars were mostly defensive or non-aggressive in nature, involving border security or anti-piracy measures. And the one aggressive intervention NATO took part in the early 2000s, the occupation of Afghanistan, was supported by Russia. However, Russia did still face a major confrontation over South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But in 2004, the dual problem of post-Soviet conflicts and NATO expansionism emerged. A new Georgian government had been elected with clear aims to reintegrate its lost territories, by force if necessary. The Georgian forces only backed down when Russian troops prepared to attack in retaliation. As for NATO, the alliance had a much wider expansion than in 1999, with 7 new nations joining: Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. This was significant because NATO now was not only expanding into the borders of a former Eastern Bloc, but into the borders of the former Soviet Union itself. The second time this conflict flared up was in 2008, and this time it exploded. At the time, US President George Bush had issued a statement in support of Georgia, and also Ukraine, joining NATO, and the US and Russia began carrying out rival military exercises in the region. Shortly after, the conflict between the Georgians and the separatists escalated into a Georgian attempt to retake separatist territory. Russia responded by accusing Georgia of genocide and launching massive attacks against its forces, leading to the Russo-Georgian War. After around 5 days, the Georgians were forced to give up and retreat from South Ossetia and Abkhazia, leading to the same sort of uneasy peace as in Transnistria. But Putin made it clear that he planned further actions if the threat of NATO expansion persisted, warning that Crimea and other eastern regions of Ukraine would be swallowed up if the country moved to join the alliance. These interventions drove a massive wedge between Russia and the West, with Western nations blasting Russia for invading Georgia, but crucially, they didn't take much real action. Normal relations continued and Russia wasn't made into a pariah. And on top of that, soon after this crisis, US President George Bush was replaced by Barack Obama, who pursued a policy of resetting relations with Russia. The issue of Georgia was brushed aside. Russia essentially had gotten a free pass, leaving an impression in Russia that their peacekeeper mentality had been validated. The reset with Russia didn't last long, as the attempt to bridge the gap between Russia and the West was scuppered by NATO's next major operation, Unified Protector.
هذه آخرتها. هذا الماء والملح اللي بيننا وبينكم، هذا الدم والأخوة اللي بيننا وبينكم. تزوروا في كل شيء علينا.
On your right now, there's some contrasting shots. People throwing shoes at a projection of Gaddafi as he was making that speech.
دقت ساعة العمل، دقت ساعة الزحف، دقت ساعة الانتصار. لا رجوع، إلى الأمام، إلى الأمام، إلى الأمام. ثورة، ثورة.
In 2011, the country of Libya was plunged into a civil war between supporters of its government, the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, and the rebels seeking to overthrow it, known as the National Transitional Council. After a month of hostilities, the Libyan government had retaken most of the rebel-held ground and was advancing on the rebel capital of Benghazi. But just as the Libyan government's advance began, NATO began their operation, Unified Protector, and attacked the Libyan army. NATO airstrikes destroyed Libyan army tanks and put a stop to the government advance, allowing the rebels to regain the initiative. For months afterwards, NATO airstrikes bombarded the Libyan army across the country, destroying tanks, air defense systems, command and control bases, and more. This allowed the rebels, who on their own were outmatched by the Libyan army, to sweep through Libya and take over the country. NATO nations also intervened directly on the ground, training and offering support to rebel troops, even after denying that they would do so.
There were tanks down this road and they tried to attack us. If helicopters were used, they could take them out, and that would help us a lot.
But help is on hand, evidence for the first time of Allied boots on the ground. Here, a group of armed foreigners, possibly British, seen liaising with the fighters. It could be to facilitate forthcoming helicopter attacks. The men left hurriedly when they spotted us. These men are fighting for a new Libya, but even they admit they can't achieve it without the planes and helicopters from NATO.
Operation Unified Protector proved to be divisive in the West, but in Russia the reaction was much stronger. with Putin bashing the so-called civilized community for attacking a small country, drawing comparisons with medieval crusades. After 7 months of fighting, the Libyan government was overthrown, and its leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was captured after a NATO attack on his convoy. He was tortured and killed by the rebels. For Putin, this was further proof that NATO was a threat. In the Yugoslav wars, NATO had taken an offensive role against a non-enemy government. But they didn't destroy that government entirely or overthrow its leadership. In Libya, the alliance had gone a step further. NATO's intervention effectively led to the destruction of the Libyan government and the extrajudicial execution of its leader. So, NATO wasn't just a concern because it was expanding its borders, but because it was also expanding its military role on the world. It changed from a defensive alliance with one purpose, protecting the borders of its members, to an offensive alliance with many purposes, including intervention in outside wars and overthrowing governments, acting as a foreign policy instrument for the US and its allies. Combine this track record of increased interventionism by NATO with Russia's post-Soviet savior mentality, and you have the perfect recipe for a new civilizational clash. These experiences gave the Russians the impression that NATO expansion had to be contained, and that while Western leaders would protest, Russian leaders could do this, because they had the power to assert themselves in the post-Soviet space, using local pro-Russian activists as the staging ground. When the Russians supported the separatists in Donbass and later invaded Ukraine, they were essentially just following their old playbook, expecting that the reaction from the West would follow the same script. Lots of complaining, lots of condemnation, but doing nothing, forgive and forget later. The Russo-Georgian War in particular was especially a prototype for what later happened in Ukraine, with the same factors and even the same narratives behind it. Put simply, supporting separatist groups and breakaway states is nothing new for Russia, because it's something that has been happening ever since the USSR collapsed. In the West, war in Europe is seen as something new, something that started in 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine, or maybe something that started in 2014 with Ukraine's separatist conflict, or for those with an even longer memory, the Yugoslav wars. But for Russia, the idea of European wars isn't something new at all. It's something that has been happening for just over 30 years, ever since the Soviet Union started to crumble. To Russia, intervention in these ethnic and political conflicts was the right thing to do. An attempt to resolve these disputes and recover some of Russia's lost influence in the world. The post-Soviet flashpoints we mentioned were just 4 in a long list of wars, civil wars, revolutions, and insurgencies that sprouted from Soviet collapse. Wikipedia has an entire article dedicated to all of them, and it's a very long list. Reading it can help paint a picture of why Russian leaders like Vladimir Putin have described the USSR's fall with phrases like the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This whole wave of terror, which has a death toll numbering in the tens or even hundreds of thousands, extended inside Russia's own borders too, sparking a series of conflicts that only officially ended 6 years ago. To Western bystanders, the transition from the Soviet Union to the countries we know of today was a mostly peaceful process, a series of events that went by without war because in the end, Soviet leaders weren't willing to use tanks on their own people or anyone else's. But this list and these examples shows us that our idea of the Soviet collapse is gravely mistaken. For much of the ex-USSR, the 1990s was hell, with the post-Soviet nations being the most dysfunctional family on the planet Earth. This all was on top of a constitutional crisis Russia was going through, which was a kind of brief, small-scale civil war in itself. To put this into perspective, imagine if the USA started collapsing over the next few months. Within a year or so, its state borders become international borders that everyone has to live with, whether they like it or not. Suddenly a world map is printed with countries on it like the Federation of New York, or the Republic of South Carolina. Hawaii is a kingdom again. Puerto Rico has to figure out what to do with itself. That kind of thing. All these new nations start pulling in different directions and fighting for their own interests. Suddenly masses of people find themselves in new countries that they may or may not feel they belong to, depending on their heritage, their background, and family history. It would be madness. It's not a perfect example. The national story of ex-Soviet states like Ukraine, Armenia, or Uzbekistan goes back a lot further than the story of the 13 colonies and what they became. But you can start to see where the problems arise. This chain of events, the long list of conflicts, many of which Russia intervened in, has come to dramatically affect Russian thinking today. This mentality is why Putin tried to draw a red line around Ukraine.
Of the security guarantees and what it will depend upon, or if something will depend upon the negotiations. Our actions will not depend on the negotiation. They will depend on the unconditional compliance with the Russian security demands today and in the historical context. In this sense, we have made it clear that any further NATO movement to the east is unacceptable. There is nothing unclear about this.
To Russia, this whole post-Soviet region is a great big powder keg that they have been trying to keep a lid on for over 3 decades. A continuation of one great long-running conflict. An episode of post-Soviet control freaking that Russia can't seem to drag itself out of, which started in countries like Georgia and now has spread all the way to Ukraine. Through this experience of collective trauma in the post-Soviet space, Russia has locked itself into the savior complex. Russia as peacekeeper, the post-Soviet police, with an exclusive right to settle conflicts in that region and ensure its security. This isn't a phenomenon that popped out of nowhere, or was impossible to foresee. It was expressed in private talks, in speeches, and in plain text. For 30 years, but it was brushed off. And now we're seeing the consequences in real time. When it comes to Russia's security paranoia surrounding NATO, it's not unfounded. In recent years, denialism surrounding the Western promises not to expand NATO has become very common. And although we did discuss this already in the Ukraine Narratives documentary, it's worth a retread to put this topic to rest. The denialism hinges on 2 basic points. The 1 inch to the east quote from US diplomat James Baker, and a quote from Gorbachev claiming the topic of NATO expansion was never discussed. You can find these points in major media outlets and even NATO itself. It is true that when putting the 1 inch east quote in context, it does seem to be referring to Germany and not Eastern Europe. But this is one quote from one discussion Soviet and Western leaders had regarding the end of the Eastern Bloc. There are many other quotes very similar to the 1 inch east quote that clearly do refer to Eastern Europe as a whole. Take this one for example, where Vice Chancellor and Foreign Affairs Minister of West Germany, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, explains in a speech that NATO should not be moving closer to the Soviet borders, as this would be an impairment of Soviet security interests. In a conversation only a few days later, he spells out directly that he is not just talking about Germany, but Eastern Europe as a whole, naming Poland as an example. He points out that the Russians must be assured that a country like Poland won't leave the Warsaw Pact one day and then join NATO the next. Baker can also be found noting that the Soviet leadership was opposed to any extension of the NATO zone. And of course, we can refer back to the conversation between Yazov and John Major. Yazov named specific countries in Eastern Europe he feared could join NATO, and was assured this wouldn't happen. All of the named countries later did. There's no possible way these remarks could be interpreted as NATO only making pledges related to Germany, and never discussing any other countries. Let's make this clear. Anyone who is claiming these promises surrounding NATO are fake, Russian propaganda or some other kind of lie is either misinformed or willfully lying. Despite recent attempts to deny the existence of these promises, it is a historical fact that they were made. And you don't have to take our word for it. You can read all of these documents for yourselves if you want to. All of these documents are sourced from the George Washington University's National Security Archive, a huge collection of documents obtained by Freedom of Information requests. The documents surrounding NATO promises can be found in sections in the archive known as NATO Expansion, What Gorbachev Heard, NATO Expansion, What Yeltsin Heard, and NATO Expansion, The Budapest Blow-Up 1994. And if you, like most people, don't want to sift through document after document to find key quotes, it gets easier. This article from the French outlet Le Crisé lists all of the key quotes on this topic and contains the documents in its sources list. Having read all of these documents, how can we explain the quote from Gorbachev? To start with, it's important to point out that this quote has been taken out of context. The quote is from a 2014 article by a Russian outlet known as Russia Beyond. In this interview, he clearly states that NATO expansion is a violation of the spirit of the statements and assurances made in 1990 and a mistake, and that he agrees that this expansion is partly to blame for the crisis in Ukraine and across Europe. But he still does make the claim that NATO expansion wasn't discussed. So how can we make sense of this? Well, we know what he's saying isn't true, because the records disprove it. But he has no reason to purposefully lie about this topic. The best possible explanation we could come up with is that he's simply misremembering these events. Remember that this interview took place in 2014, almost 25 years after these events took place. So aggregators are pointing to a single quote from the time and an out-of-context quote from someone misremembering the events to deny the mountains of evidence that these conversations did happen. Along these two main arguments, there are two other less common denialist arguments surrounding NATO expansionism. These arguments being that there was no reason for the Soviet Union to seek guarantees surrounding NATO expansion, because they never expected Eastern European nations to ditch Communist Party rule, and that there was no formal treaty between the West and USSR surrounding expansion, and so Western nations aren't obligated to keep NATO contained. Here's an example of these 2 points being perpetuated. The first of these arguments is very easy to disprove. It's another variant of the argument that the conversations never happened, but based on different logic, rather than an appeal to authority by citing Gorbachev. This interpretation tries to point to the timeline of events. The theory goes that in 1990, when the USSR and the Western Bloc were holding these talks, the Warsaw Pact was still very much intact, and the Soviet Union never expected that to change. So they didn't discuss the idea of former Warsaw Pact countries joining NATO because it was just unimaginable that it could ever happen. Again, as with the Gorbachev version of this argument, we can easily prove that this theory isn't true by just looking at the records. But we can also look to the timeline as well. While the Warsaw Pact didn't legally dissolve until 1991, its members started drifting from Communist Party rule earlier than that. By the middle of 1990, every single Warsaw Pact country other than the USSR itself was ruled by non-communists, and most of them had already made the switch to non-communist rule by the end of 1989. When we look at when these events took place, the theory that the USSR had no idea the Eastern Bloc was over when they were holding talks with the West in 1990 can be seen for what it is. Complete nonsense. The second of these arguments, the treaty argument, is an interesting outlier, because unlike the other 3 arguments, it isn't misleading or false. There is no treaty legally requiring NATO to avoid expansion into Eastern Europe, and there never was one. The only legal deal between Soviet and Western powers regarding NATO expansion is specifically related to Germany, where as part of the unification of East and West Germany, NATO powers agreed with the USSR that in exchange for unified Germany being allowed to remain in NATO, NATO troops would stay out of former East German territory. To this day, a lot of people have wondered why the Soviets made sure this deal was put in a binding treaty when it came to Germany, but not the rest of Europe. The answer is Germany was a special case. During the Cold War, most of Europe's nations were either part of the Eastern Bloc or the Western Bloc, aligned to the Eastern Warsaw Pact or the Western NATO alliance. Germany was aligned to both because of its division between East and West. Germany, ever since World War II, was never a genuinely independent country. It was legally under a joint occupation between World War II's historic allies. And so for Germany to be legally reunified and restored to independence, there had to be a treaty between those allies addressing all of these issues, not just a series of promises and speeches and backroom conversations. For the independence of the rest of the Eastern Bloc to be restored, these sorts of complex legal treaties weren't needed. The Soviets were the only occupying power, so they simply needed to leave for the independence of these countries to return. Gorbachev didn't seek treaties to keep these nations out of NATO, because he simply believed what he was told by Western leaders that NATO wouldn't expand. He was naive. The problem is that after the Soviet collapse, the two sides developed drastically different points of view. The Russians, as the successors of the Soviet Union, believed that the West should still have stuck to their promises, even without there being a binding treaty forcing them to do so. Western nations, on the other hand, believed that since the nation they had made their promises to was gone, they had no reason to stick to them. In the end, the Western argument won out, and NATO was expanded. There's nothing illegal about this, but just because NATO expansion wasn't criminal, doesn't mean it shouldn't be criticized. Even though there wasn't a treaty legally blocking NATO expansion, it's still a fact that Soviet and Russian leaders were led to believe that expansion wouldn't happen, and that they voluntarily dismantled their Cold War power bloc in the 1980s based on these promises. It's not a surprise at all that they felt cheated after the promises were ditched. This experience taught the Russians the exact wrong lesson, that good faith doesn't produce results. By expanding NATO instead of rolling it back, we taught the Russians that the era of power blocks wasn't over. The reason they've been stuck in a Cold War mentality is because we shackled them into it. In the 1990s, there was a genuine, historic opportunity to promote peace, good faith and cooperation between East and West. The Western powers took that opportunity and threw it into the trash bin. Of course, if it wasn't clear already, this explanation isn't designed to justify Russia's actions, because these events don't. We filtered these events through the Russian experience to give you an idea of what politicians on that side of this conflict are thinking. But that filter obscures the whole story. So here's a reality check. It's just an unfortunate reality that the borders of the post-Soviet states are not sacred. That there are sizable groups of people inside some of these countries that wanted to separate. But this is a fact that works against Russia as well. When we mentioned the problems caused in Glasnost, we mentioned 4 major separatist conflicts: Chechnya, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Transnistria. But we didn't mention what happened to Chechnya in the end. We didn't mention this example in the timeline because it's kind of an outlier. Unlike the other 3, this separatist movement ultimately failed, and unlike those 3, it wasn't pro-Russia, but anti-Russia. As the USSR was dissolving, a Chechen nationalist group, known as the All-National Congress of the Chechen People, declared independence in the Russian region of Chechnya-Ingushetia. The Ingush part of the territory left to join Russia, while Chechnya became the independent Chechen Republic. Russia refused to recognize Chechen independence, and this led to the First and Second Chechen Wars, which took place from 1994 to 2000. After the separatists achieved victory in the First War, forcing Russian forces to retreat from Chechnya, they were defeated in the Second, and Chechnya was reintegrated into Russia. By the time of the reintegration, the prominent Chechen nationalists had been wiped out or defected to the pro-Russia side, and the separatists that remained were mostly fundamentalist Islamic rebels, who waged a low-level insurgency in Chechnya and surrounding Russian territories as the Caucasus Emirate until 2017. The terror wave we mentioned taking place in Russia that only ended 6 years ago, that was this conflict. The Chechens never got a referendum to decide between independence or unity with Russia. Everything was decided for them by bombs and bullets. From the example of Chechnya, we can see that the existence of all these post-Soviet separatist movements is uncomfortable for everyone. When separatists emerged in Georgia, Moldova, or Ukraine, Russia was happy to acknowledge them and call for their recognition. But when they emerged in Russia, it was apparently an outrage. Suddenly, territorial integrity mattered. In turn, Russia's savior mentality is understandable, but not justifiable, because it's built on self-serving hypocrisy. And this is a hypocrisy Russia's enemies are learning to exploit. Recently, Ukraine became the only nation to recognize Chechnya as an independent country. And that isn't just for show. The Chechen separatists have become notable allies of the pro-Ukraine movement, with several Chechen militias fighting for the Ukrainian cause. So all being said, the picture is quite murky. The Russians have had legitimate grievances regarding NATO expansion in the past, which caused unnecessary confrontation that brought us towards the conflicts we're in now. But the Russians are definitely not innocent either. They have a huge part to play in their current dilemma. After all, NATO in the first place was founded as a counterweight to the Soviet Union's interventionism. where it had grabbed huge portions of Europe, either as annexed territories or satellite states in the aftermath of World War II. That legacy of Soviet expansionism is why many former Eastern Bloc countries sought to join NATO after achieving their independence. And since then, the forceful interventions of the USSR's successor, the Russian Federation, to resolve the territorial disputes of its neighbors, have only increased that ambition. For every Transnistrian, Abkhazian, or South Ossetian separatist that felt protected by Russia's interventionism during the post-Soviet wars, there was a Moldovan or a Georgian feeling threatened. And nations that feel threatened seek security guarantees. And let's not forget, at each stage of a Russo-Ukrainian war, Russia was the instigator. They created the Euromaidan crisis in the first place by strong-arming Ukraine's government into dropping negotiations with the EU. They turned that crisis into a war by annexing Crimea and fueling the insurgency in Donbass. And then they widened the scope of that war by launching the 2022 invasion. Every one of these stages has pushed Ukraine to turn further westward and closer to NATO. We can and should critique Ukraine's responses to this meddling. The unconstitutionality of Yanukovych's removal, the thuggish street wings of the Maidan movement and their legitimization as foot soldiers of the Donbass war, or the fact that Ukraine's NATO aspirations brought forward the war they were supposed to deter. But the reality is that at each stage of this crisis, fault has been with the Kremlin. They have absolutely no right to play victim. The Russian leadership has no self-awareness on this at all. They complain endlessly that others don't understand their growing opposition to NATO expansionism and interventionism. Yet they fail to understand why their neighbors would turn to NATO as Russia itself becomes more expansionist and interventionist. Russian militarism has essentially acted as a perfect ad campaign for NATO engagement and NATO membership. It's almost like the Streisand Effect. The more you try to stop it, the more it keeps happening. These politicians in the Kremlin are hatching plans intended to ensure Russia's security. But these plans come at the expense of the security of their neighbors, and that turns these neighbors towards the anti-Russian alliance. A feedback loop. They somehow have failed to grasp this, the fact that they are the catalyst for their own nightmare. A possible explanation for this is that they simply haven't even considered the views of these NATO applicants, because they believe these countries are simply being controlled from abroad. They don't realize that any country could actually want to join NATO. In the Russian propaganda narrative, it's all through force, a conspiracy. And this is their potentially fatal mistake. They believe their own lies. And ironically, Moscow's obsession with Ukraine hasn't just alienated its wary neighbors, but also its allies. As Russian troops are forced to pull back from other commitments as their military is bogged down in Ukraine. For example, in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, a post-Soviet conflict between the countries of Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Russia previously acted as a mediator, Russian troops failed to uphold their peacekeeping role. And a peace agreement that was supposed to freeze the conflict ended up collapsing. As a result of Russia's Ukraine obsession, Armenia and Azerbaijan ended up looking towards new powers for aid, with Armenia moving towards the west and its neighbor Iran, and Azerbaijan focusing on its neighbor Turkey, undermining Russia's sway in the post-Soviet space. The end result of the conflict was that the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh ended up being blockaded, bombed, and then annexed by Azerbaijan, with its population, most of which were Armenians who had voted for independence from Azerbaijan, forced to accept Azerbaijani citizenship or leave to exile in Armenia. Within weeks, almost the entire population had chosen exile. An entire region turned into a ghost town, showing just how much of a joke Russia's peacekeeping mission really was. Each of the international powers involved in the Ukraine conflict have made miscalculations and convinced themselves of lies. NATO countries convinced themselves that they never pledged to restrain expansionism, and they wrongly predicted that the Russians would not eventually put their foot down and use force if they felt they could not prevent this expansion through diplomacy. and the Russians convinced themselves that this NATO expansionism was all by coercion, that if they used force, local populations wouldn't resist, that the peacekeeping monopoly could be preserved. These misunderstandings have led us to the conflict we know today. But not all sins are created equal. The irresponsibility of NATO powers in expanding their operations after the Cold War, rather than winding them down, is a major contributing factor to current Ukraine conflict. But it was the Russian leadership that made the final decision to cross the point of no return, based on the wrong assumption that forcing Ukraine out of NATO would make Russia safer and more secure. This strategizing is rooted in the era of conventional warfare, from the past century and the centuries before it. In that period, creating buffer territories between you and your rivals was a powerful strategy. Russia's experience of being invaded time and time again by foreign armies like the Allies and the Central Powers of the First World War and the Axis powers of the Second has led them to try and close vulnerabilities in their borders by expanding them to more defendable territory. It's why the USSR locked down the whole Eastern Bloc in the first place, to make sure they had the most uninvadable country imaginable, a kind of safety in distance. Russia's attempts to annex eastern Ukraine show a continuation of this doctrine in the modern day. But modern weapons have fundamentally changed this dynamic. Intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads mean that entire cities or even countries can be destroyed without a single soldier having to set foot in enemy territory. For territories that possess these weapons, the conventional war era is over. Russia doesn't need power blocks or puppet states, because even if they were surrounded on all sides, they would still have the capability to deploy over almost 6,000 nuclear weapons. With that kind of firepower, any sort of missile defense can be overwhelmed. And the NATO alliance holds this power in return. It doesn't matter if Russia holds Donbass, whether they reach the Dnipro or even the NATO border. Russia's cities could be wiped out today, tomorrow, next week, next year, in the next decade. This isn't a point we're making as some kind of threat towards Russia. We're making it to show that the fundamental premise of Russia's mentality is wrong. A return to the spheres of influence and power blocks of the First Cold War doesn't make anyone safer. Nuclear capability makes nations safe by itself, because it makes any would-be invader pause for thought, and then take their hands off of the trigger. These sorts of misconceptions and false narratives are what you get when you keep yourself in a bubble, when you have a rigid worldview, open to no challengers, and try to drown out alternatives in a wave of useless noise. It seems like now more than ever we could all do with having a bit more of an open, analytical mind. And the first step in doing that is learning to tell the difference between attempts at serious journalism and attempts at pandering to one faction or another. But that's something we can talk about more next time, in the next episode of the series on the Ukraine conflict. For now, I hope we've shed some light on the mindset on the other side of the world. Just remember, explanation and justification aren't the same thing. Next time we'll discuss in detail the role of the far-right, neo-Nazi and neo-fascist groups in the Ukraine conflict. Those on the pro-Ukrainian side, the pro-Russian side, the international groups attempting to gain from the fighting, and the propaganda trying to distract from this problem. Until then, we have to put this series to rest again. But we'll be back, and you can be sure of that. Thank you for watching Mega.